Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our series by looking at the nation of Germany and how well it performs in the year 2025. Now, for this series, what I do, in case you missed the first installment, was I play 10 games with a lineup, then I give you the full report of how many games I won, kills per death, and all that good stuff, and then give you my thoughts on the various vehicles and how they currently perform. And before we get started, I will give a brief shout out because this is the first time that I can recall that I have ever seen a member of my squadron in a match. It's possible one of you guys have been in a match before, I just haven't seen you, but in this case we do have Flexmore, who I just happened to notice had my squadron tag, so hey Flexmore, how's it going? So below is the lineup I was using for this particular experiment. I ended up with a 70% win rate, 48 kills, 25 deaths, gives me a total kills per death of 1.92, average kills per game of 4.8, and average deaths per game of 1.7. Overall, a pretty good performance. The 70% win rate certainly helps, and the 48 kills were pretty solid. Now, one thing I didn't really go into in the last video is that the goal of this is simply to see how many games I can win and how well I can do in those matches. So I am taking out the best vehicle for a given situation. What this ultimately means, and this kind of runs counter to what a lot of people think in top tier, is that I didn't really spawn a whole lot of aircraft during this whole endeavor, and that's kind of to be expected. As much as a lot of people think aircraft are powerful and they are difficult to interact with and somewhat toxic at times, aircraft also are often not the most impactful on the battlefield because they don't exercise a persistent presence in the way a tank does. In that respect, if you do want to be able to secure capture points, secure parts of the map, lock down aspects of them so the enemy can't use them, usually you are best off in a ground vehicle, although aircraft can be very impactful if you get to a point in the match where the enemy struggle to actively contest you. And as one final aside before we get started, I always encourage people to try different things. I always encourage people to test stuff out. In all of the games I played, I always like to experiment with weird or one-off builds. However, one thing that I have kind of noticed throughout all this experimentation is that more often than not, the general consensus is correct. The thing that all of the sheeple online tells you is good actually does end up being good. It's pretty uncommon to find a diamond in the rough that everybody else just missed. It does happen, but it is pretty rare. So whenever you're going into this kind of experimentation to try and find the best solution to a problem, you need to be prepared to accept the fact that what everybody thinks is right might actually just be right. This sounds kind of obvious when you spell it out, but there's a strong tendency of players across a lot of games to be super contrarian. Well, actually, the thing people think is really good isn't actually the best thing, but usually that's just not the case. So, in order to avoid just being contrarian for the sake of contrarian, I always like to keep an open mind and be prepared for the outcome that maybe the thing that everybody thinks is good is actually good, but keep an open enough mind to explore some unusual options to see if they strike my fancy. And speaking of the things that people commonly think of as good that are actually good, we have the German main battle tank lineup, and specifically the Leopard 2A7V. I ended up 200 spawn points off of a nuke in 2 separate games out of a random sample size of 10, which, considering how infrequently I get nukes, is actually pretty remarkable. Overall, the 2A7V is actually probably the best tank in the game, and you don't really need me to tell you this, but I am just kind of confirming what everybody else probably already knows or at least suspects right now. What really marked the Leopard 2A7V out coming straight from the Abrams into the 2A7V is that yes, the 2A7V feels a little more sluggish to use in terms of things like acceleration and turning, but also it's definitely more forgiving in terms of the armor and the penetration of the shell. There were definitely some instances where the Leopard 2A7V was able to shrug off hits that almost certainly would have crippled or taken out the Abrams, and also where the 2A7V was able to land kill shots where an Abrams would have otherwise struggled. It really is one of those scenarios where that extra little percentage of survivability and that extra little percentage of penetration is enough to make a difference in enough situations that it makes the vehicle feel subjectively much better to play, and objectively will often lead to you getting better stats. And of course, anybody who's been following the channel, we've already explored this a bit because the Leopard 2A7V had the best stats of any tank in the entire German ground tech tree, so it's not really a shock that it is in fact that good, especially because on average the German players, and the American and Soviets as well, tend to be weaker players than the minor nations, so if it's throwing up such good stats with an on average at least weaker player pool, you know it has to be good. This does naturally segue into a bit of a discussion in terms of how the general nerfs to the Leopard 2 family have specifically affected the 2A7V. Both the nerfs to the turret basket and also the nerfs to the depression over the back of the vehicle. Honestly, both of them just lead to some scenarios where if you are immobilized, you will not be able to fight back. Either A, because the enemy's knocked out your turret ring, or B, because the enemy knocked out your engine and then drove past the angle where you could get your gun down on them. Certainly, it will result in deaths in scenarios where had these nerfs not been implemented, you would have been fine, but considering the 2A7V is still throwing up outstanding numbers, I wouldn't say it hurts the vehicle that much overall. And part of this is actually because of how the turret basket was implemented. Gaijin stopped short of implementing the full turret basket due to some player outcry, so what you actually get is some elements of the turret basket both high and low, but this means if the enemy is hitting relatively center on the vehicle, it's not getting that much shrapnel to the high and low aspects of the turret basket because of the spall liner. So while it definitely happens, you also do get quite a few scenarios where rounds fail to get enough shrapnel on the turret ring to actually disable it because of the spall liner. And this obviously does lead to the 2A7V basically behaving the same way it did before the basket was added. The depression over the rear arc realistically doesn't matter in that many scenarios. It can be a little annoying if you're trying to reverse into shots, and in very close quarters urban environments, enemies can sometimes knock out your driver or your engine and drive past you, but it is a pretty situational drawback because in order for it to affect you, the enemy has to both be able to immobilize you and also get behind you, which is just kind of uncommon, and usually if that's happening, there's some other failure. Either your team is collapsing or you're lacking in overall awareness, etc, etc. So usually it's not that big of a deal. The backup tank does warrant at least some discussion. It is the 2A6. I've talked about the 2A6 in the past. If there is a 2A6 available for a top tier lineup, I will always put it in the lineup. The L55 DM53 is an excellent shell. You still have good turret armor and decent-ish upper front plate armor, honestly. Still a very solid hold down vehicle and has better mobility than the 2A7V. I feel the 2A6 is probably the most underrated tank at top tier because while it's the source of very little if any real discussion, it never fails to perform for me personally, and the stats on it for all the nations that have it available are still quite good as well. Overall, I think the 2A6 is almost mandatory in any lineup that has the option to include it. The Leopard 2 PSO might make the cut in this lineup if it had a spall liner or if it had an L55 gun, but because it has neither, it really feels like it just doesn't offer enough for the overall weight increase you get, especially compared to something like the 2A6. And the 2A5 is basically just a downgrade. The difference in weight is only about 0.4 tons. You're not really going to notice it, but the extra punchiness from the L55 gun does come in handy. Overall, I really do just stand by my assessment. I had the best score out of any vehicle in the 2A7V so far. It's done excellent for me. My very first game, I went 8 kills and 1 death, and the death wasn't even to an enemy ground vehicle. It was to an enemy plane because my team was getting wiped out. So I really just think the Leopard 2A7V is the best you can get, and the 2A6 is an excellent backup. I think this is the best lineup you can get for top tier MBTs right now. Now, I did recently go over all of the top tier SAM systems in a little bit more depth, so I don't feel the need to do a full review or anything of the Iris-T right now. Overall, I will just say the Iris-T, if you do have a scenario where you can set it up, the Iris-T is one of the best SAM systems in the entire game pretty comfortably. Additionally, the Iris-T does have some counters, things like LD IRCMs, and it's not perfect. It is a big, hard to move system, so it is more vulnerable to things like GPS guided bombs and basically a lot of the other SAM systems, especially the more mobile ones. However, the long range and the good tracking on the missiles are pretty solid and can make it difficult to avoid, on top of the fact that it has a pretty stout radar overall. And on top of all of that, it actually has an excellent inventory of missiles, 8 per launcher with a full reload. The Iris-T can just spam people out of the air. It is a very good SAM system, but because of its large size and the fact that there are 3 vehicles, the Iris-T can be a little awkward to use on certain maps, and indeed, if your team is starting to get weak in some areas or even starts to give up ground on the part of the map you're on, you can very easily get wiped out. It is just a big, easy target. As far as the light vehicles, the real reason why I currently use the Vilcus plus Boxer combination is because I want that added wheeled mobility that you don't really have access to on the Leopard 2s. And this also creates another interesting question of like, why don't I use the Rod Kampfwagen? The big reason why I don't use the Rod really comes down to The rod has a pretty slow reload for top tier, it doesn't have any thermals, and it also has a pretty weak shell that often struggles to deal with things like Russian double stacked ERA on the side. And this makes a vehicle that you can certainly have success in the rod, I'm not saying you can't, and it's an incredibly fun vehicle to drive, don't get me wrong, I love playing the rod. But I just don't feel it's as competitive at top tier as something like the Boxer MGS. The only reason the Vilcus is in the lineup, and I always try to emphasize this when I'm talking about the Vilcus because I don't want somebody to get the wrong impression, this is an amazing vehicle and they should definitely buy it off the market. It's a pretty mid vehicle, it has a slow firing autocannon, decent enough penetration and some spikes, but really just the fact that it's a wheeled vehicle with that weapon system is what gives it a capability that the rest of the German lineup right now currently lacks. Certainly the Puma VJTF has comparable weapon systems, but isn't as mobile as the Vilcus. So the ability to do that really fast wheeled flank is part of the reason why I think it is a solid inclusion in the lineup, even though the vehicle itself in a vacuum is definitely a bit on the mid side. Now, as far as the Tiger UHT is concerned, there is another Tiger you can currently get for Germany. It's very okay. I honestly don't think it's any better than the UHT. You might as well get the UHT. The only strength the other Tiger has over the UHT is that it's not completely hosed by LDIRCMs, but let's be honest, you just kind of have to eat that drawback on the UHT because your primary weapons are the PARs and the Mistrals. And the PARs and the Mistrals are still, well, the Mistrals are not very good, but the PARs are pretty solid missiles. They're still capable. They still get the job done. You still have 8 of them, and the helicopter itself is reasonably agile with the mass-mounted sensor. It can also peek over terrain. Overall, I think the Tiger UHT is a perfectly serviceable helicopter. Not having a way to deal with LDIRCMs, I do think makes it a little weaker than some of its contemporaries like the Mongoose, the AH-60, or the Tiger Hot Block 2 for France, but it is still pretty capable. It does have the type of weapon systems you generally want on a top-tier helicopter. And of course, this wraps us back around to the Typhoon, and this also wraps us back around to an interesting point, is I didn't really address other options other than the Typhoon when I initially did the Germany video, and it has changed a little in this area. For starters, you do now have access to the Swiss F-18s. The Swiss F-18s do have access to Mavericks and AMRAAMs, and this is actually a pretty decent combination. It's at least competitive with the Eurofighter 2000, although the overall ammo capacity of the F-18s is a little limited because you only carry 1 Maverick per pylon. So you only get a total of 4 of them, and when you're carrying 4 of them, you only get 2 AMRAAMs and 2 AIM-9M, so not the most powerful armament in the world in terms of air-to-air. Additionally, they did space out the top bracket for aircraft and ground and the top bracket for ground vehicles and ground, so now it's top bracket of ground vehicles of 12.0, top bracket of air vehicles is 13.0, so there's at least some more merit for the F4F ICE coming out. The F4F ICE does have AMRAAMs, it does have Mavericks, doesn't carry very many of either, and the flight performance is kind of trash, but it does at least have the types of weapon systems you would want. However, this is negated a bit by the Tiger UHT being 12.3, because if you have the Tiger UHT in your lineup, you're almost certainly going to be locked into 13.0-ish matchmaking. You can see an entire 13.0 lobby at that point, so why not just take a Eurofighter or an F-18? It seems like you might as well just go with one of those options at that point. If you don't have the Tiger UHT, it's probably worth considering the ICE. The Eurofighter Typhoon isn't really an amazing CAS aircraft. It's acceptable, it gets the job done, but it's not going to be lighting the world on fire. And the Swiss F-18 very much in the same vein, so at least worth that consideration. But if you do have the Tiger UHT in your lineup, which I imagine a lot of people will given how much easier helicopters are to research right now, then you might as well just go with the Typhoon in my opinion. With all that being said, while the Typhoon's weapon systems with the laser guided missiles are more limited than they used to be, I will say the Typhoon is an absolute joy to fly and can still very much clown on the vast majority of hostile aircraft, so it clears the skies really efficiently and still can carry a good amount of ordnance to wreck ground targets when it sees an opening. So I still think the Typhoon is very much worth it to have in your lineup, and it's a very solid CAS aircraft, even if it's kind of unremarkable in a lot of areas, especially when it comes to affecting the ground battlefield. So it's time to start milling our way towards some sort of overall conclusion, and my overall conclusion was that you'll notice that I had a very similar KD that I had in Germany that I had to USA, but I had a lot more kills and I had a lot more deaths, and a lot of that was because in Germany I felt more comfortable spawning more vehicles because it felt like more of the matches were winnable based on the lineup I had at my disposal. It just felt like when playing the German lineup, you had the tools to make those miracle comebacks happen with the vehicles, whereas the USA lineup, it often felt like more of the matches were simply unwinnable, and part of that may be the teams. Obviously, the 2A7V being a more forgiving MBT to play means on average your teammates that you have with Germany are going to survive longer, and on top of that, the Iris-T is a very easy SAM system to use, and your teammates that did get housed in the 2A7V, 2A6, etc., spawning in an Iris-T and potentially keeping the skies clear certainly didn't hurt matters at all. So overall, I would say that right now I do consider German top tier to be the best top tier lineup currently in the game. The air could use a little bit of work, the MBTs are great, the anti-air is great, the light tanks basically do their job. On the whole, a lot of the lineup feels like it does its specific job very well, and that is often what you need a top tier lineup to do. When I spawn a plane, I can clear the sky of enemy planes and still have ordnance left over to take out ground targets. When I spawn a helicopter, I can get into sneaky positions, fire off a salvo, and get some kills. When I get into an MBT, I can either brawl or snipe as the situation warrants very efficiently. When I get into light tanks, I can motor around the map very quickly, capture points, execute flanks, etc, etc. The lineup does what you need it to do in basically every area, and that's a big part of the reason why I consider Germany top tier to be one of the best. And I will do a side note, if you don't have either of the Boxer vehicles, the Puma VJTF and some of the other options for Germany in the mainline tech tree are still perfectly fine. You could still have great games in them. I just prefer the Boxers because I think that extra little bit of mobility they adds a lot to what the lineup can overall do. And certainly if you can get by with the somewhat weaker gun and lack of thermals on the Rod is more mobile than either of the Boxers, and if you can get past the disadvantages of a lack of thermals, weak shell, slow reload, etc., the Rod is easily as good as both of these vehicles. It's just a question of how good are you at overcoming them. So it's not that the tech tree has no options with this much mobility, it's that it does have some harsher limitations than you'll find on vehicles like the Boxer MGS. But at this point, I would say Germany are in an excellent spot in terms of their overall performance and their options for the top tier environment, which honestly, considering the state they were in before a lot of these vehicles dropped, is actually pretty impressive. This is a pretty solid comeback story, because a long time ago they had at best the Leopard 2 PSO, they didn't have the 2A7V, they didn't have the Eurofighter 2000, they didn't have the Iris-T, they didn't have the Boxers, and they also didn't have the F-18. So over the course of the last roughly year and a half or so, Germany has done an excellent job of ramping up from having some pretty noticeable gaps in its capabilities to being a very solid all-around nation to play, and in my opinion, the best nation you can be playing right now at top tier. With that being said, part of the motivation for this series was a sort of put your money where your mouth is kind of deal. Certainly anybody can go on the internet and claim Nation A, Nation B, Nation C is the best at top tier, whatever, but doing all of these nations and giving my opinion side by side with the unfiltered stats I had when playing them over the course of 10 games does give you an idea of how accurate those overall impressions are. Of course, that's just my opinion. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of Germany top tier. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I always love to hear from you guys. If you like the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.